Is it worth it to try and become a pilot in 2021? In this video, we're going to talk about some of the pros and cons. We're going to go into the compensation of pilots, also the difference between, say, an airline pilot working for a national airline versus a regional. We're also going to talk about some of the cons, how hard it is actually to become a pilot in 2021. But first, what is an airline pilot and what do they do? In this video, we're actually going to go into airline pilots. We're going to release a different video on commercial pilots. Airline pilots navigate the flight of fixed-wing aircraft. This is usually on a scheduled route for the transport of passengers and cargo. This is different from commercial pilots where the flight is actually unscheduled. There are regional airline pilots, national airline pilots, and even international airline pilots. Some roles and responsibility include responding to and reporting in-flight emergencies and malfunctions, starting the engines, operating controls, working on a flight team with other crew members, using instrumentation to guide flights when visibility is poor, performing minor maintenance work, and choosing routes, altitudes, and speeds. One of the first advantages to becoming a pilot that I want to get into is pilots are still pretty desirable from women. According to Tinder, they have, in 2016 and 2018, they looked at the most right-swiped jobs. So they actually found that women tend to right-swipe on pilots a lot more than other occupations. In 2016, pilots were number 1. And then in 2018, they fell one place to number 2. But pilots are still really desirable from the opposite sex, specifically women. Apparently men aren't as into female pilots, or maybe there's just very few of them. So maybe it's the pilot voice, but for some reason, women still find pilots really attractive. So what does it take to actually become a pilot? There's actually 3 different ways you can become a pilot. One is through the military, and you can get all your flight hours and training through the military. One is through private lessons, and another one is through flight school. Historically, the military has been a great way for people to become pilots, but unfortunately, in recent years, the military is more and more focusing on drone warfare, overusing pilots. So this is going to lead to less pilots entering the workforce from the military going into the future. So this could lead to a potential shortage of pilots going into the future. We're actually going to get into employment trends a little bit later in the video. So more and more people are going to try and become pilots through flight school. And the big problem with this is actually getting funding. If you were to go to a college and university and get a bachelor's in pretty much any program, the federal government will provide funding through grants, scholarships, usually just college loans. But flight school is different. Many flight schools are ineligible for federal loans, meaning you have to go to private banks and private institutions in order to raise money to pay for your flight school. This means your credit actually has to be good enough for a private lender to let you borrow money from them. And some private lenders won't even do this. They won't allow you to borrow money for flight school. So you really have to search for certain institutions and banks that will actually provide funding for you to go to flight school. I actually knew a particular guy named Mike who couldn't get loans from any private institutions in order to pay for his flight school. So his mother actually took out money against her house in the form of a HELOC loan and gave it to her son in order to pay for flight school. He ended up going through flight school, got a pretty good job afterwards, but he basically had to use some family wealth in order to pay for flight school. And this is really common for this kind of occupation. Now, many airline pilots have a bachelor's degree, but not all of them. It seems that a lot get into the occupation without getting a bachelor's degree. According to the Occupational Information Network, based off their sample of airline pilots, about 6% actually hadn't finished high school, 18% of airline pilots had a high school diploma, and about 61% had a bachelor's degree. And this kind of gets into a lot of major airlines. In order to work for a major airline like Delta and fly national, you often need to have a bachelor's degree. But maybe to work for a regional airline, maybe the standards aren't quite as high. So maybe the 18% with the high school diploma went in through the military, didn't get a bachelor's degree, but they're hired anyway at a regional level. But in order to get and work for a national airline, often it is required to have a bachelor's degree. Next, we're going to get into the compensation of airline pilots. What kind of compensation can airline pilots expect in 2021? Like I talked about previously, there's kind of a dichotomy between regional airline pilots and national airline pilots. There's a huge pay gap in between them. Unfortunately, the government just kind of averages them together. So first, we're going to look at the average number, and then we're going to get into splitting up the regional versus the national airline pilots. So using data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, airline pilots do really well even when you average both regional and national. The average base salary for an airline pilot was around $187,000 per year in 2020. This is much higher than air traffic controllers, commercial pilots, ambulance drivers, bus drivers, pretty much every other similar occupation. Airline pilots are seeing really great wage growth. In the year 2007, the average base salary was $113,940. This grew to $186,870 in 2020, just 13 years later. When you look at the 13-year wage growth for airline pilots, it was about $5,200 per year. But just in the past 5 years, the wage growth has really accelerated. The average wage growth from 2015 to 2020 for basically the average for all pilots has been growing by $8,400 per year. So this is actually higher than a lot of physicians. So airline pilots are seeing fantastic wage growth year over year. To forecast this into the future, if this wage growth continues, by 2024, the average base salary would be around $207,000 per year, and by 2030, $238,000 per year. And that is both regional airline pilots and national airline pilots averaged together. According to Cron.com, in 2020, a regional airline pilot salary range was between $50,000 and $131,000 per year. And they also report that for a national airline pilot, they're kind of capped at around $400,000 per year. So there are some airline pilots earning more than $300,000 per year pretty easily, and then they're capped at around $400,000 per year. So airline pilots can do really well financially, but the job market is really competitive right now, which is what we're going to get into later in this video. First thing to understand about airline pilots is the workforce isn't as big as you would think. You'd think there'd be tons of airline pilots out there. Actually, the workforce is about 83,550 strong. So there's far less airline pilots than there are, say, truck drivers, bus drivers. So it's definitely a smaller niche occupation compared to some other occupations. Another thing to consider if you're particularly entrepreneurial, there are no airline pilots that own their own business. This is in sharp contrast to commercial pilots. According to the government, about 5% of commercial pilots own their own business. So if you're a little bit more entrepreneurial, maybe you want to own your own plane and do tours or something like that, maybe just focusing on being a commercial pilot might be more in your wheelhouse. So for the entrepreneurial minded people, commercial pilot might be a little bit better, just sticking with that as an occupation. But to get back to the job market for airline pilots, in the year 2000, there was about 94,820 employed. This dropped, hit a low in 2012 of about 66,000 employed, and then it's risen since. It's risen to about 83,550 employed in 2020. So over 20 years, the number of employed airline pilots has been kind of stagnant. And the coronavirus pandemic has not particularly helped things. Although when you look at the difference in the number of employed between 2019 and 2020, there's really not much of a difference. The pandemic really didn't hit airline pilots really that hard. In contrast to, say, flight attendants. A lot of flight attendants lost their jobs. It'll be interesting to look at the 2021 numbers to see if maybe more airline pilots were laid off from airlines. But from 2019 to 2020, there was very few layoffs. But one thing to keep in mind regarding the job market, the airline pilot workforce is particularly old, and all of these guys actually are forced to retire at the age of 65. So because a lot of airline pilots are in their 50s right now, there could be quite a bit of opportunity for airline pilots going into the future if there's a lot of airline pilots that retire in the next 5 to 10 years, or as of right now, by law, they're forced to retire by the age of 65. Some of these guys will just end up becoming commercial pilots, but there could be a little bit more opportunity working for the airlines because of this particular factor. But as of right now, when you look at job boards, it is extremely competitive to become an airline pilot. There's not a lot of national airlines hiring right now. In fact, if you go to Glassdoor, Indeed, or LinkedIn.com and you search for airline pilot in any of these job search platforms, there's hundreds of jobs. There's not thousands of job postings, there's hundreds. According to Glassdoor.com, when I did a search, there was 112 job postings for airline pilots in the United States. On Indeed, 131, and on LinkedIn, 248. Now, maybe I wasn't using the correct keyword. I was just using airline pilot. If you just search for pilot, there was maybe like 4,000 or 5,000, but definitely pretty concerning as of right now. And this is probably because of the pandemic. Airlines just aren't hiring very many pilots as of right now. But once the pandemic is hopefully over in the next year or two, this will change. People will start traveling again. Business travel in general is down like 80 to 90% when you look at hotel numbers. So many hotels are vacant right now. So if this bounces back, it could definitely drive more and more job opportunities for future airline pilots. Finally, we're going to get into Myers-Briggs personality types. A lot of people, when they're choosing a career, want to choose a career where their personality is going to be compatible. According to the Myers-Briggs company, certain types are attracted to certain occupations. According to the company, the most likely Myers-Briggs type to become an airline pilot is the ESTJ, also known as the director. Number 2 would be the commander, the ENTJ, then the persuader, ESTP, and then the inspector, the ISTJ. So these are the 4 most likely Myers-Briggs types to become an airline pilot. So as you can see, there are pros and cons of trying to become an airline pilot in 2021. Job postings right now are extremely scarce. It's really competitive to try and become an airline pilot at this particular moment in time. Although wage growth has not slowed at all for airline pilots, they are making more money than ever. And pretty much every single year over the past 5 years, they have been earning more and more money. This is a great occupation for someone that really wants to earn a lot of money. And airline pilots are apparently still desirable, according to Tinder. If you enjoyed this video, definitely check out some of my other content where I go into similar kind of factors and variables to help you choose an occupation. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.